They renamed it New York's fabulous luxury apartments. Well, fabulous is not a word that I use. So I
Good
totally.
evening, everyone, and welcome to the Bloomingdale Neighborhood History Group's February presentation.
You want to
I'm
turn it on?
Stephanie Azarone. I'm a member. Can't hear, hold on. Is that better now? Not better. Oh, yeah. How's that? Doing, the experts are doing an adjustment here.
Right.
That's this one over here. How's that? Is that helpful? Can you hear me better? People are shaking their heads.
Right now.
How's this? Ah, good. All right, let's do this again. Welcome, everyone. I'm Stephanie Azarone, and I'm a member of the Bloomingdale Neighborhood History Group Planning Committee. And on behalf of the group, thank you all for joining us today. Those of you here in the audience at the Bloomingdale Library and those of you with us on Zoom. We have a very exciting evening planned for you. But before we begin, just a little bit about the Bloomingdale Group. We were founded more than 20 years ago. Our mission is to discover, explore, preserve, and share the history of the Bloomingdale neighborhood, which runs from 96th Street to 110th Street, from Central Park to Riverside Park. We do this through education and research, and we offer a broad variety of services with that goal in mind, all of them free, including a really informative website, a terrific newsletter. It's issued on a quarterly basis. I have learned a great deal from it. We, in the past year, have started a number of exhibits here at the Bloomingdale Library itself on the first floor. And yes, question in the back? Can you get closer? Is this better? Yeah. Thank you. All right, so as I was saying, we have a number of exhibits here at the library itself on the first floor, one of which you will hear more about today. And we have walking tours by Jim Mackin, our very own Jim Mackin, the Upper West Side tour guide extraordinaire, and also author, I might say, of a wonderful book called Notable New Yorkers of Manhattan's Upper West Side. So we have that, and of course we have a number of presentations such as tonight's. We have two more coming up. One is on February 22nd, in which Gary Dennis will talk about the lost theaters of Broadway and Upper West Side story. And on April 3rd, and both of these are Zooms, Robert F. Rodriguez will present Voices of the Stones, which is a unique behind the scenes look at the wonderful stone carving in the unfinished tower of the Cathedral of St. John the Divine. So if you would like more information about our group, please visit our website, which is upperwestsidehistory.org. We also have a donor button on the site for anyone who would like to help support what we do. And we have a sign-up sheet at the table by the door. If any of you have not yet signed up, we would appreciate that. Okay, so to begin the evening, this is actually a two-part evening. The first part is the presentation of the Forain Award, and part two is the presentation on the Old Community. And to make the award presentation, I'd like to introduce Marjorie Cohen. Marjorie, come on up.
Yeah, you'll.
Okay. Hi, this is so wonderful to see all of you people here. It feels like, like another in-person, like the old days, doesn't it? I have a happy task tonight, and that is to present the Jim Terrain Award. And Jim, Terrain, you're going to hear more about him tonight. But Jim was lived in the Old Community, and he grew up there, and he was living there when the Old Community was dispersed. And he was somebody who worked extraordinarily hard to keep the group together. And we honor him tonight. He was part of our planning committee. He died in 2017, and we honor him each year with an award. And the award is going tonight to Andrew Alpern, who is among other things, an architectural historian, a lawyer, a writer. And he's been a friend of the neighborhood history group since he wrote his Posh Portals and came and gave us a wonderful talk about the various entryways on the Upper West Side. And the award is meant to be for somebody who really kind of understands the kind of work we're doing. And I just wanted to quote this. I need to read because Andrew sent me an email that had this in it, and this is why he's getting the award, and this is the kind of thing that we want to keep on going. He said, remembering what used to be here is just as important as looking critically at what is here now. And we believe that very firmly. So here is the award. Andrew, will you come up, please? And I'm going to read you what it says. Jim Terrain Award for Outstanding Commitment to the History of the Bloomingdale Neighborhood. For researching and celebrating the architecture of New York City with attention to our Bloomingdale neighborhood in his latest book, Posh Portals, and for teaching us to look carefully at the buildings around us. So, Andrew, thank you very much for everything.
Thank you. Thank you very, very much. It is indeed an honor to be recognized for my efforts to inspire all of us to look up at the buildings around us and see the decorative embellishment that many architects and builders have put on many of the buildings on the Upper West Side. Many of these buildings are still here, but many of them are no longer here. This organization has made yeoman efforts to uncover and promote the architecture, both of the present and, what is perhaps even more important, of those buildings that are no longer here. This evening, we are going to hear about a group of buildings and the people who inhabited them that form a very real part of the legacy of the Upper West Side. I am looking forward to watching and hearing it. I suspect all of you are too. Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Andrew. Thank you, Marjorie. And now on to part 2 of our program. In the opening years of the 20th century, a group of Black New Yorkers moved to West 98th and 99th Streets between Central Park West and Columbus Avenue. Restricted to 2 city blocks by discriminatory rental practices, their patch of Bloomingdale became a close-knit village that was home to between 2,000 and 4,000 people of color for half a century. The old community, as it became known, was raised in the 1950s in the name of urban renewal. Amazingly, the former residents, though widely scattered by the destruction of their neighborhood, stayed connected for decades after its disappearance. This evening, speakers will bring to life the story of this unique community, focusing on its people, schools, social organizations, businesses, and its remarkable afterlife. A highlight of the evening will be an in-person interview with Buddy Green, a longtime resident of the neighborhood who will share his stories and answer audience questions. Our presenters will be Susan Freedy, who has extensive ties to the old community and lives in Park West Village, the development that replaced it. Over the past months, Susan has worked to organize the Bloomingdale Neighborhood History Group's old community archives that are housed here at the Bloomingdale branch of the library, making them easily accessible to the public. Rob Garber, where are you, Rob? There he is. Rob Garber, author and designer of the exhibit about the old community on display at the library, is a member of the Bloomingdale Neighborhood History Group's Planning Committee. And at that, I will leave it to all of you. Thank you.
If anybody besides me has forgotten to turn off their cell phone, please do it now.
For those of you on Zoom, we're just trying to finish the last link in technology here. You may be able to see the screen, but we're still working on getting it up here. There we go. Excellent. While Michael's finishing the last touches, I'm going to begin. I'm Rob Garber, and I'm the setup guy. We're really here to listen to Susan and Buddy, but it occurs to us that not everybody in the audience or in Zoom land is as familiar as many of us are about this community that we're going to be talking about. So there is a display downstairs that will be there for the rest of the month. And for those of you who can't make it, it's also going to be available as of tonight at the BNHG's website, which is upperwestsidehistory.org. So you can look at these posters as slides to your heart's content, which is by way of apologizing that I'm going to hustle through them to get to the good stuff. So don't worry if you can't see everything. If it goes too fast, that's intentional so that we can get to Susan and Buddy. But these are the posters as you'll see them downstairs. The first poster basically tells the origin story for this community that we're talking about. Unlike an awful lot of neighborhoods in New York, this one has a very defined start, almost exact date, and a unfortunately rather abrupt end date. That's not very common in a neighborhood in New York City. And the first slide tells the story. Black people have been marginalized in New York City, but they've been here since the Dutch colonial days. And this sketch, which was made in the 1930s, shows some of the neighborhoods that people of color have lived in over the centuries. And if you take a close look, there's a semicircle, sorry, in the Upper West Side at 99th Street and Central Park West. And that's the subject of our talk tonight. The newspaper article on this slide is a rather remarkable one. In 1905, the New York Times ran a full column article with the headline, "Negroes Filling Up 99th Street Block." And with the casual racist language that was typical of the time, it told a kind of amazing story. In the prior year, it said a white landlady on West 99th Street was in a feud with one of her neighbors. And to spite her neighbor, she kicked out her white tenants and put up a big sign offering to rent it to black tenants. And she found them. And there was not only instant interest by black tenants looking for a place to live, but there was also an opportunity that was seized by black real estate entrepreneurs, of whom the best remembered, the best known, perhaps the most active, was Philip Payton, who's here on the left. If I can risk one chart, one graph, there's actually a lot of information to our story embedded in it. The columns are populations, numbers of people, with the tallest ones about 2,000. The blocks are just that. The clumps going left to right are blocks, 100th Street, 99th Street, 98th Street, as recorded in the census. The federal census is every 10 years, but in the first half of the 20th century, New York State also did a census on the fives. So we have an unusually rich data source of populations, at least as defined by the census takers, which you have to take sometimes with a little bit of a grain of salt. And what they show, going from 1900 to 1950 for each of these selected blocks, is the story that we're starting to tell here. The blue columns, the blue bars are white population, and the red bars are the black population. And in 1900, 99th Street, this happens to be specifically the block between Central Park West and Columbus, was all white. Then we saw that newspaper article about this phenomenon going on. And sure enough, in 1905, there was a significant black population. It was in the few hundreds, whereas the whole block has about 2,000, a steady population of about 2,000. By 1910, it was nearly all black and stayed that way through at least 1950. We'll hear more about that. 1950 is the most recent census that's publicly available. The rest of the story that this tells is that even the immediately surrounding blocks, such as Central Park West or Columbus Avenue, right around 99th Street, or 97th or 100th, stayed white. And the interesting additional piece of the story is that 98th Street gradually got a black population. It was not abrupt the way the change was on 99th Street, but after World War II, in those few years, it too became majority black, so that the black population on these two blocks was 4,000 people in the late 40s and early 1950s. So what kind of a neighborhood was it? That's what we're going to hear about. And I'm only going to take a moment to show this slide. It's another one of the posters. Well, it was a neighborhood that had a church at the heart of it. St. Jude's Chapel was the heart of the community. There was a clubhouse. On the side streets, on the numbered streets, there were a number of businesses whose names you can't make out. You can see them up close, largely run out of people's apartments. These were 5, 6-story tenement buildings, but in 1905, they were quite new. And then on Columbus Avenue, of course, Central Park West has never had retail, but on Columbus, there were what you'd expect. There was a movie theater, there was a butcher, there were bars, there were restaurants. A remarkable aspect of this very concise, very tightly defined community was a remarkable number of very notable people who lived there. And you should have a lot of fun reading about these remarkable people. There were a lot of people from the music industry or musicians. There were inventors. There were attorneys. Billie Holiday's mother ran a restaurant. And if you watched the pregame activities at the Super Bowl last night and you saw them give the Walter Payton Award, you may have heard Andra Day sing Lift Every Voice, written by James Weldon Johnson on West 99th Street. So as I think I mentioned, this community also had a rather abrupt ending. And it's an awful story. After World War II, there was federal legislation which put federal money towards what was variously called urban renewal, or more typically in New York, slum clearance, which gave communities, cities like New York, the right to take property by eminent domain for redevelopment. And perhaps not surprisingly, since everybody's favorite villain is Robert Moses, he had his eye on this Black community in the heart of the Upper West Side. And indeed, eminent domain, so-called Title I of this program, was invoked. Property was turned over to developers who were corrupt. The buildings were allowed to deteriorate. Tenants were encouraged, forced to move. They were given promises that they would be relocated, that there would be funds to help them. All the promises were broken. And as you can see, this is a before picture, actually an aerial photo that shows it was a dense, kind of typical series of tenement blocks. This, astoundingly, was a photograph that was used to demonstrate, to justify the need for clearance and renewal, a block that a lot of people would find attractive. And this is the after, completely razed and then left to sit. It became, the developers had already been paid off. It was a scandal, which if you read The Power Broker by Robert Caro, you learn that it was one of the first chinks in Robert Moses's armor, led to this long eventual downhill slide. But it sat unbuilt for years. And then finally, the developers were ousted and Park West Village went up in the place where this community was. As I'm sure we're going to hear, it wasn't called the old community by its residents. It was West 99th Street, West 98th Street. But as has been alluded to a couple of times, there was a remarkable afterlife because especially one guy, but maybe more than that, Jim Terrain wouldn't let it go. The residents dispersed to other parts of Manhattan, to other boroughs, sometimes out of state. But Jim Terrain, whose family, I have to say, is represented here tonight, welcome and thank you, hosted, kept it going through a remarkable number of get-togethers year after year. People came from near and far to remember what was increasingly then called the old community. And with that, I want to hustle off the stage and turn it over to Susan and Buddy.
All right. People hear me all right? Good. I've been given the unenviable task about trying to talk about a whole neighborhood of thousands of people over 50 years in like about half an hour. So I'm going to move fairly fast and hopefully leave some time for questions so we can talk about the things that people are interested in rather than the things that I think are interesting. It, you know, as Rob's poster showed, the 99th, 98th Street community was, really was an island in the midst of white neighborhoods around. And I thought to try to sort of give it a frame, I was going to focus on 6 families that I chose completely at random from the census data. And by sheer coincidence, they all turned out to be related to me. And closer? Good. Okay. In 1905, which was the same year that William Peyton bought the Philip Peyton bought that first house in 99th Street. My great grandmother had come from Charleston, South Carolina, and was living on 98th Street, 99th Street, with 6 of her 10 children. And I don't think they stayed very long, but it seems like they were there at the very, very beginning, which I was surprised to find. Nobody in my family seemed to know that, even the ones who had lived on 99th Street later on. And they were part of this Southern migration, people coming up from the South. Reconstruction had fallen apart, and things were not very pleasant in the South, and a lot of Black people came north. Just as an example, in 10 years, from 1890 to 1900, the African-American population of Manhattan grew by 41% in 10 years. And it kept growing after that as well for quite some time. So people needed places to live. And the areas in New York where Black people left were way, way, way overcrowded, and they needed other places to go. So going forward 15 years, there's the Grant family, which we're going to hear a little bit more about, is I don't seem to have a cursor. Why don't I have a cursor? Yeah. Okay, we'll go without the cursor. That's right. I can point here. In the cases where it really needs pointing, the cursor is actually more to help me be focused. So the Grant family, who were from the West Indies, were living in number 20, which is down at the eastern end of the block, right, the Central Park West end of the block. And my uncle tells me that over the years, they developed kind of a pattern where the West Indian folks stayed more to the eastern end of the block, and the folks who were coming up from the South mostly stayed down at the other end of the block. And I don't think there was any real hostility between, but there also wasn't a lot of interaction between the two groups, except the children. The kids played with each other. At the same time, my great grandmother, who had moved on, but one of her sons has now grown up and was married and has his own family. And they lived in 98th Street sometime in the late 1920s. And they were in 98th Street when it was still mostly white. And there was one end, the Columbus Avenue end, that had some Black families. This is one of Rob's charts, which will be slightly confusing because the colors are reversed. The red lines are the white people and the blue lines are the Black people. So, and this is, oops, sorry. Over here in the middle is 1920. And you can see that the 98th Street still had a very small number of Black people there. And that was this is on the north side of the street. The southern side of the street was almost totally white at that time. So 10 more years, 1930. It is the Gill family I'm going to introduce. They were West Indian and they lived on the West Indian end of the block, following the pattern. And there was also the Brangman family, who were living just a few doors down, but across the street. And they weren't either West Indian or Southern, so they didn't fit the pattern. Warren Brangman was one of the children. All these families had other children, but I've only chosen a couple to mention. He was one of the many young men in the old community who served in World War II when the time came. They lived in the old community through many of them through the Depression, which was and then the war came along and they got drafted or signed up and went. And when Warren came back from the war, he got married and moved to San Juan Hill, which is the other neighborhood that had been Black even sooner than the 99th Street neighborhood. And they actually had a similar history, though. Only they got hit twice, in 1947 They raised a good part of the neighborhood, tore down everything and built the Amsterdam houses, which is public housing project, much rather nicer than most of the public housing projects. But nevertheless, a lot of people were displaced when it was built. And then in 1955, along came Robert Moses with his urban renewal, and the rest of the neighborhood was completely obliterated in the same way that 99th Street was later on. So in 1933, we meet the Strain family, who moved directly to 98th Street without going through 99th Street first. And the folks on 98th Street were a little bit sort of separate from the 99th Streeters. The 99th Streeters never went to 98th Street to visit. I think it was the other way around, perhaps. So it's a little unusual that the Strains, who only lived on 98th Street, they never lived on 99th Street, remain connected to the neighborhood. And the middle son, Leon, but he's Buster here. Buster, a very common nickname in those days. And he remained connected to the community for many, many years after. And here he is at one of the reunions. And as you can see, he's no longer 10 years old in this picture. So this is many, many years later. And he was part of one of the committees that helps everybody stay in touch, which I'll talk about in another minute. Now we're in the sort of middle 30s here. This is the Green family on the right. And they are, this is Buddy's family, although I haven't listed Buddy here. I just listed his three sisters, for reasons that'll come clear in a minute. And they are an interracial family. My grandmother, Florence, was a white woman from London in England, and she met my grandfather when he was in the British Navy. He was from the British West Indies. He was in the British Navy during the war, and he met her in London. And they decided to come to the United States and settled on New York for nobody really knows why. They were living at number 17 at the same time that the Grant family over here was living at number 17. They had moved from another spot on the block. One of the sisters in the Grant, the Thelma at the bottom of in the bottom yellow bubble here, is she was 13 at this time, but later on, she became very active in the Baptist church in the block. There were only two churches. One of them was St. Luke, the Baptist church, and Thelma became a chaplain or something in that church. This was the little building that church operated in for 25 years. They ended up moving out before they knew that the urban renewal thing was coming, and their pastor had changed, was retiring at the time, and they decided that it was time to get out. So they moved to a building on 123rd and Morningside, and it's still there. St. Luke is still operating at 123rd and Morningside. But the Greens and the Grants, who were living in number 17, were actually right next door to St. Jude, which was the Episcopal church in the block, and which was at 19 West 99th. And St. Jude was very, very active and very community minded. It wasn't just a church. The building was put up by St. Michael's Parish. When Blacks first started moving into the community, they were in the diocese or whatever it's called, that, in the physical area that included, that St. Michael's was supposed to, take care of. And, but the parishioners did not want the Black people to come to church at St. Michael's. And the minister, whose name I've forgotten, unfortunately, was rather annoyed. And apparently he couldn't persuade them, and apparently he couldn't just make them. So he lectured them basically, and told them that if they weren't going to allow the Black people to come to church there, that they had to do something for them in 99th Street where they were. They had already hired, the church had already hired a Black minister, Reverend Howard, Florida Howard. His first name was Florida. And this is him in the center of the photo there, conducting a wedding. And Reverend Howard, and initially his wife, although she died only a few years after they started work, unfortunately. And they had done a great deal of work in a couple of makeshift apartments that they rented from someplace. And they had a choir, and they had a school for small children, and a sewing group, and all kinds of activities going on. But they really had no financial support, or very minimal financial support from the diocese. So the pastor at St. Michael's gradually persuaded his community that it was their responsibility to do something. And so they built St. Jude's Mission, which was a very sturdy, beautiful building. But it's just squeezed in between two of the apartment buildings, number 17 where the Greens lived, and number 21 presumably on the other side. And but do you want to tell us a little bit about Reverend Howard and the time that you got to go up to his place and heard him playing the flute? Right. There we go. I'm sorry. I should come over. No, what's good.
Like this?
Pinned here. There you go. Perfect.
You wanted to know about Reverend Howard.
Right. Yes.
Very withdrawn man.
Oh.
You never saw him outside of the actual church services. He didn't interact with the parishioners.
Sorry. I'm gonna take this over so that you in the room can hear. Just talk. I'll hold it.
Oh.
Yeah.
You wanted to know about
Reverend Howard.
okay. He his apartment was on the top of the church. And that was a pretty isolated place. Most of the parishioners never went upstairs to that level where his apartment was. And it was an unknown territory to most. One year his son evidently came home from college, and for some reason or other, I forget how we became acquainted, but he took me downtown to see that movie Fantasia at the Radio City Music Hall, which was a fantastic thing back then. And when we came back, he took me up to the apartment, and Reverend Howard I think I was the only kid in the block who ever saw, much less went to the apartment up there. And it was a sort of a refuge of his. As I said, he was withdrawn. He didn't interact with the population socially at all. And I remember when I first went up there, he had these two dogs. He had a German Shepherd and a big, huge.
A Great Dane. Yes. Oh,
Yeah, big, huge Great Dane.
sorry. This is Buddy's sister, my Aunt Gwen, who also lived in, I didn't know was going to be here tonight.
Hey, anyway, so he invited me to the apartment, and it's the first time I'd seen him in those settings at all. Every time I saw him, he was in church with the robes, and he was very ministerial. Anyway, he was relaxing in his chair, in his sofa chair, and playing the flute. It was the first time I'd seen a flute close up. First time I'd heard one individually, otherwise outside of a big orchestra. And evidently that was his hobby. That was his release. He didn't play very well. It wasn't too musical. It was persistent, but it wasn't musical. But I could see that it was his solace. He really got some joy out of the thing. And I listened to a few concerts because enough to know that it wasn't too musical, but it was serious.
One of the things that I read implied that after the Reverend's wife died, which she died quite young and rather unexpectedly, that he became kind of a different person and a much more subdued and less sort of optimistic kind of person. Of course, that's only one person's opinion. I don't know if that really was true or not, but and why he was so reserved. But So 1935, the Gill family who had been at the other street, they moved over to number 52, and by now their daughter Marjorie was a leader of a Girl Scout troop. And this is the troop over here. Why they're in front of the Poland Monument, I have no idea. This monument is in Central Park, for those of you who haven't seen it. And I read once why it's there, but I don't remember. One of the activities that St. Jude had for people was they had scout troops. They had summer camps I think the summer camps were run by the YMCA, and there was some sort of hookup, and they would go there to camp. Did you ever go to Camp Weppawag? No, okay. That was the name of one of the camps, according to a photograph I have here. And there was also a Boy Scout troop. This very thin fellow in the Smokey the Bear hat is Mr. Green over here. Do you want to tell us why you're the only one in a hat?
At that time, all Boy Scout equipment was pretty expensive. It was very well made stuff, but it was pretty expensive. And I was the only member of the troop that had a full uniform.
And why were you able to afford a full uniform?
I got hit by a car when I was about 15. And my folks got awarded a sum of money, and the only reason they could afford to give me a uniform.
Right.
I was the only member of the troop that had a full uniform.
Mm-hmm. Well, yeah, the
Yep.
rest of them apparently only had undershirts, at least in this picture. And in case you were wondering, Buddy can't remember what it is he was showing people how to do here.
Oh,
So
you mean in that picture?
yes, in that photo.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
I don't know what I was
Yeah.
doing.
Sorry. So we're up to 1940, and the Bragman family had they were living in a different area. This time they moved to 72nd Street, and they were West Indian family, and they moved to no, I'm sorry, not the Bragmans. Sorry, forget that. But they moved down to the other end of the block, and there's no real sort of link here, but I wanted to show this particular page because when they started doing the reunions, they started out as a sort of an annual dance kind of thing, and then they became reunion dances, and then they became reunion dinners and so forth after the neighborhood was broken up. And Jim Terrain, who you've heard a lot about already, has been, he was made himself responsible for putting together all the materials that would go with a particular event. So this is the 2004 reunion, right? There was an invitation with an RSVP card inside, and then there was the abbreviated program that had the names of some of the prominent 99 streeters, and a detailed program of what was for dinner and everything else for the event. And then often there was also a booklet with articles and photographs about some of the 99 streeters and so on. And on the back of one of these programs, not this one, there was this page that you're seeing on the slide here, which they made an attempt to list or at least highlight many of the different organizations that were part of the 99th Street enclave. The churches, we already talked about St. Jude and St. Luke. Holy Name is the Catholic Church, the same one that's still over here on 96th in Amsterdam. And there was also Trinity, which is right next door to the library here. Although I don't think there were many Black people who were Lutheran. So I don't know that they were. It's one of the reasons probably it wasn't listed here among all these other names. And the schools they went to, it seems like the vast majority of the schools of the children in the block either went to PS 175 or 179. A lot of the girls, I believe Joan of Arc was a junior high school, and I think it was all girls at the time. And anybody, yeah.
Was what?
Joan of Arc, was it all girls?
Yeah.
Yeah, okay, I thought so. And a lot of the kids, especially the boys, but some of the girls too, also went to Commerce High, and there were other schools as well. And then we had some teams and athletic facilities like the YMCA and the PAL, Police Athletic League. And then there were all these other names that sound to me like musical groups. One or two I know. The Channels near the bottom there, next to the PAL, was a musical group. There was Earl Lewis, I think, in the Channels, and Earl Lewis lived in 99th Street. So I don't know if these other groups had people that lived in 99th Street or whether they were just popular there. The Starlets and the Young Pythons, the Lotharios, and the Harlequins and the Bells and so on. And they also have the names of some of there's the stickball team and the basketball team and so on. So there was a lot of community activity going on as in addition to the the ordinary things that you would expect. So even though it was a very small geographically neighborhood, there was a lot of activity. And one of the most important ones was the West 98th and 99th Street Association, which seemed to be the movers and shakers in the old community. Were all in charge of the 99th Street Association. And they sponsored a lot of activities. They sponsored these dances and in the summertime, picnics and hay rides. I don't know how you manage a hay ride in the in the middle of Manhattan. But it was one of the things that was listed as what they could do. At some point, I guess after the neighborhood broke up, they kept going up to a point, but then some of them were moving away and some of them were passing on and some of them were just getting too old to bother anymore. So they then sort of passed it on to the next generation, who called themselves rather laughingly the 99th Street Youngsters, because at the time that they took this on, they were probably all in their 40s and 50s. And stayed the youngsters for quite a while, until like that got absurd and then they changed the name at some point. And this is on the left here is the front page of a directory that they put out apparently in 1989. And they had the list of over 200 names of names and addresses of the ex 99th Streeters, and where they had moved to from when the neighborhood was split up. So, and there was always a call out for, please send us more photographs, more, things, memorabilia from the 99th Street days. Getting back to the families, starting in fairly close succession here in 1940, Langdon Freedy, who's the one that's known as Buster, is another Buster on this side, on the left side there in the white curve, and married Dorothy Green, Buddy's oldest daughter, sister. And then a couple of years later, when Eddie Jr. was on home leave from the Army, because the war had already started, he married Marjorie Gill from the Gill family that we've heard about. And when he came home from the Army, they lived with her parents for a while, and the whole thing didn't work out very well, and they got divorced in 1945. Sit closer to the microphone, sorry. I shouldn't have touched the microphone. I should have just stood closer to the microphone. Okay. Okay. How about I talk louder? I can do that. Okay, we'll see.
Yay.
We'll see. I didn't do anything. Really, we don't have very far to go and I can talk louder. Okay, yeah. Can people hear me in the back if I talk like this? Okay, I can. I'm my uncle's daughter's niece. So they got divorced in 1945. And then here came one of the Brangmans who married one of the Strains in 1946. And then Eddie, who'd just gotten divorced in 45, remarried in 1948, married one of the Green sisters. Those are my parents, Eddie and Mildred, Mimi. I don't see anybody taking notes. I'm going to have a quiz in a minute. Alfred Strain, one of the younger Strain family, the youngest of the Strain family, married a woman who was not a 99th Streeter, but after they got married, they moved to 98th Street. So. And then there was Edgy Grant of the Grant family, who married Gwen Green, in 1951. And then the last of the group that I put on the slides, Leon Strain, the other Buster, the Buster on the right-hand side of the slide, married Dorothy Freedy, in the lower left-hand corner over there. And this was very common. I went through this whole rigmarole just to say that, you know, since it was such a closed enclave, and yet it was large enough, you know, there were 3,000 people or so, you know, it was possible to find a suitable mate among that group. It's not like a little village where they only had 200 people, right? So a lot of the residents found mates and lifelong friends among the population of the 98th and 99th Street community. So, and then in 1992, I came along and moved into this building, which actually, when I looked down from my balcony, I would be looking down on the roofs of where the 99th Street block was back in the day, and sort of bringing it up to date, even though the neighborhood is obviously very different than it was at the time. So we have a little time for questions. The library closes at 7 and we're supposed to be out of here by 6:45. So, be glad to take some questions.
How did they respond to this and what was going on? The expectation.
As far as I know, and there are other people who probably know more about this than I do, there wasn't much organized opposition from within the community. You know, these were relatively poor Black people in a society that didn't think Black people had the same rights as everybody else. There were politicians and other people who tried to oppose it to a certain degree, but Robert Moses was very powerful in those days, and this urban renewal thing was a great thing for the city. They got lots of money. They took, you know, public lands, sold it to private developers, and gave them huge tax breaks to build all these buildings, like the one I now live in. And it did take a long time, but the time span, it was like 10 years from the time they first, you know, said they were coming in to do this, before anything actually really got built. But that was mostly corruption within the folks that were behind the plan. You know, it went to developers that didn't have the money to build what they said they were going to build, and lots and lots of scandals. There's a big thick file downstairs with millions of articles about the whole debacle. Angel?
Did Buddy tell the story about some notables that he met? He told me an earlier one before.
Oh, yes.
Oh, I was telling you about Billie Holiday.
Yeah.
Yeah. We didn't even know she lived in the block. Her mother actually owned the apartment. And we knew her as Mom Holiday, but we never connected it. It was Billie Holiday's mother. And she owned a restaurant at the far end of the block down near Columbus Avenue. Just went downstairs. It was sort of a sub-level thing. And it was a successful restaurant. And once they had a block party of some kind, I don't remember what the block party was, but I think local politician organized it or something like that. But anyway, she appeared on the steps of her apartment house and sang to us. I didn't even know what the block party was for. I didn't know she lived in the apartment. I knew Mom Holiday, but I didn't know it was Billie Holiday's mother. But she appeared as one of the features of the block party, and she stood on her stoop and sang, and I stood at the base of her about 5 steps down, looking into her mouth as she was singing. And you're asking me something.
Well, about a better question, but about how old were you? Do you think?
12, maybe,
Okay.
13, 14.
Right. Well, okay, so the mid-30s, that would be sometime. Bubba's born in 27, right?
Yeah,
The late 30s, right?
I was born in 27.
Can I ask about, you mentioned that there were music.
Mm-hmm.
Could you just, what kind of music scene?
I don't remember. A lot of that activity took place after we moved.
Can you speak louder, Bub?
Yeah.
Don't worry about that mic. It's this mic that they can't hear from.
Oh, okay.
Right.
A lot of that those musical groups were formed after we left 99th Street.
Mhm.
Um,
Yeah, I forgot to say that none of the families of the 6 families that I chose to represent were still in the neighborhood at the time that the neighborhood broke up. So,
yeah,
so
we were long
can't tell
gone.
that part of the story.
We were long gone by the time they razed the neighborhood,
Yeah.
destroyed it. But I do remember it was a common thing for a group of 3 or 4 or 5 guys to get together and just spontaneously begin to sing and harmonize. It was a natural, normal thing. And there were groups like that all the time. In fact, it was a common thing. You'd be standing around with a couple of the guys and somebody'd say, oh, let's, or a guy would start singing a song and a tenor would join in, a baritone would join in. And next thing we had groups like that all over the place. So a lot of those things were just formed spontaneously.
You have people
But the
singing
music
in the
was around.
stairwells.
Pardon?
You have people singing in the stairwells.
In the stairwells.
Yes, they used to sing in the stairwells in apartment
Oh,
buildings. 'Cause
yeah.
We got an echo from the, right.
Sometimes we were in the apartment building, yeah.
Yeah.
But we didn't do too much of that because the neighbors would come
Well,
out. What are you doing? We had most of the apartment buildings were 5 stories. Occasionally there were 6. But most of them were five stories, and you had 2 families on each level. So there are a lot of people in that small building. And
I can't say about where the weddings all happened, but I don't know if you can.
I didn't quite hear.
Yeah,
I didn't quite hear it.
she was asking, because I talked about all the couples that got married, and she was saying,
Yeah.
where did all the weddings happen?
Oh,
Right.
they have their different times and
Yeah, yes. Yeah, some of them were, years after they moved from the community, so, right. They may or may not have been at St. Jude's or at some other church. And what was the second part of your question? Oh, yeah, so people split up all over. Some went to, other places, some went to San Juan Hill, which didn't work out very well because then they got kicked out of there too. Others went to the Bronx, they went to Brooklyn, they went to Queens, they went out to Long Island. Some people moved away altogether to another state. I'm going by that directory that I showed you, and people were really all over, some of them out on Long Island. Now that was in 1989, which is a good, 15, close to 30 years after the community broke up. So people had really spread out by then, but they mostly just did not go to a place. And none of them, this question often comes up, did any of them move into Park West Village, right? Which was built to replace it. And the answer is no. First of all, it was like 10, 12 years from the time they got kicked out of their apartment. They had to have some place to live in the meantime. And secondly, they couldn't afford it. Park West Village is supposed to be middle income housing at the time. And that's why the developers got tax breaks and so forth to build middle income housing. So, and most of these folks couldn't afford that.
yeah, I think very few people from 99th Street moved into that.
Sorry? Oh, hi, nice to meet you. Uh-huh. Mm-hmm. Well, the Greens moved around quite a bit. They went to the Bronx first, right after they left the 99th Street neighborhood. And then they moved to a couple of places, and it was still the Depression in those days. People moved around a lot. Where downtown? Uh-huh, okay. So all the way downtown, yes. Cherry Street. Uh-huh, okay. Mm-hmm. Yeah, well, thank you. That, for the folks who weren't able to hear that on Zoom, that gentleman, is a nephew of Jim Terrain, who, organized the, reunions. And, he was just wondering more about where people lived.
What was
What was the schools like that you went to?
they were the usual public school, pretty crummy.
Mhm.
The teachers weren't too qualified. They weren't people that you would select as good teachers. I mean, temperament wise.
Yeah.
The schools were the usual public education,
Mhm.
not too good. I remember many times you would get a failing mark on your report card. And the failing marks were always in red. The rest of the marks were blue ink.
Right.
And if you were deficient in some area, like I was in anything involving figures, mathematics, or arithmetic, period, I was lousy in. But nowadays, if you're weak in a subject, you get supplemental help of some kind, right? There was none of that.
Mhm.
None of that. In fact, they pushed you through whether you were qualified or not. They pushed you through. Nowadays, if they can't graduate you, right? If you're not at the elementary level, unless you in the junior high and so forth. But then they just pushed you through to get you out of there.
One of the things that Buddy pointed out to me was that, and I do have some photographs somewhere of, here we go. That most of the classes were, it was basically a white neighborhood. So most of the schools were mostly white, and there would be typically, 2 or 3 black kids in a class. So that was one way in which it was different growing up in 99th Street than growing up in some of the other black areas.
Oh yeah, if you grew up in Harlem,
Right.
all your classmates were black.
Mm-hmm.
But we PS 179, that was the elementary school,
Mm-hmm.
and junior high school 109. That was Robert E. Simon Junior High
Okay,
School,
on 109th Street.
109th Street between Broadway and Broadway and Amsterdam, between Broadway and Amsterdam. That was the junior high.
Yeah, that is still there.
Right,
Yeah, yeah.
right. But the schools we went to, all the kids from 99th Street, we were like the only 2 or 3 in the class.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
That was our whole upbringing. Yeah. Yeah, that class has what, 4 of them? 5?
Yeah,
Yeah,
more or less. And
Okay.
that was later. That was in 56. So in
Right.
56, there were even fewer.
right.
So I only see 2 kids there.
The friendships between the white and the black kids who were going to school together?
Not really. I made friends. I had friends. First of all, almost all the kids I went to school with were children of immigrants. They were first born Americans. Some of them were born overseas and came over with their parents. But almost all my classmates, non-black classmates, were children of recent immigrants. Some of them didn't speak English too well, or they spoke with an accent. And I remember I became friends with different guys from time to time, and they would take me home. And that's when I'd walk into this immigrant family's home, and it was like you were in that country. If the guy was Italian, you walked in there, you were like in Italy, because these people were right off the boat. They were really right off the boat. And they were so pleased that their child had an American, because they considered me an American. They were not, they were right off. They were so pleased that their kid had a buddy who was a real American.
Right.
Anyway,
One more question over here. No, I think the last one was in 2016. And there was one planned for 2017, but Jim Terrain got taken ill very suddenly. And I think that one never, am I right about that? Anybody know?
what was that?
What I was asking about the reunions and how long they went on afterwards,
Oh.
but I know you don't.
Yeah,
you
yeah, I
get
don't know
to
much
that.
about them.
Right. Yes.
Are you aware of the memoirs that people might have written about life?
Nothing in terms of a whole book, but yeah, in the file downstairs, which we've been referring to this, when you first come into the library downstairs and you walk toward the circulation deck, in the corner there, there's a big file cabinet, that is all the Bloomingdale Neighborhood History Group archive, I'm calling it. And in drawer number, whatever it is, the 3rd drawer, I think it is, there's a big fat file on the whole community. It's broken down into subgroups. So I encourage people who are interested to go and browse through that. And it is relatively organized at the moment. And there's a lot of information there. There is one, I don't know the origin of this booklet, but there was a booklet of, I don't know, 15 pages perhaps, of called Memories of, I don't remember. And they interviewed a few people who lived in the old community. And a couple of them had, I was really struck by some of the same stories that this gentleman told, to some of the things my uncle told me in that file. Well, yeah, I mean, in terms of statistics and things, yeah, that's mostly the stats. But a little of it was from, family memories is how I got interested in to begin with. And also I've done a lot of family history research, so I knew how to do censuses and so forth. And that's where I could approximate the dates of where people lived when, if they didn't appear right in the censuses. And I use the archive a lot. There's a lot of information down there. I learned a lot more from working there about St. Jude and a lot of the activities and Reverend Howard and so forth, and quite a few other things. And then lately I've been talking to my uncle about it a lot. Don't talk to my aunt so much because she was little when they moved out of there. Still fairly little, right? And doesn't remember as much. Stephanie?
Susan, I know that Buddy wasn't living there when it was raised, but do you have any idea how much time people had when they were found out they were going to have to move?
Well, I know that they were supposed to be given a certain amount of time. I don't remember how much, but the developers were not the most honest people in the world. Some of them would put up official looking posters saying you have to be out in 10 days, which had nothing, they had no, reason to do that. And there were some people who resisted moving out and stayed a long time, even, and they started cutting services and so forth. And it, became horrible to live there, but some people stayed because they were stubborn, and or had no place else to go. And and all the help that they were supposed to be getting with resettling, they were supposed to get, first priority at public housing in other parts of the city. And seems like very little of that happened. There's a report in the file from the women's community something or other. It's a women's group that did they were just a volunteer organization, and they did a lot of personal interviews with folks during the time that they were being kicked out. Had they found housing yet? Where were they looking? What could they afford? And so forth. And compiled some statistics on that. And they did a follow-up report a few years later after people actually had moved on. And there's a lot of data there on those kinds of questions. Last.
Jim Train used to speak about different community activities, and he was really positive about it, and that they came from not just from the churches and the organized activities, but also from different buildings, and they would organize trips. Anybody can speak to some of those things, but I would love to hear more about it. It was something that he was really proud of the neighborhood.
Of about 10 brothers. Well, he had 10 brothers and 1 sister.
Wow.
So we grew up listening to all of the facts and details. He might be on the cousin. But yeah, they did a lot of that things. Yeah, it was to try to
Yeah.
That was one of the things. Before Jim did, and it was a great okay. And you put person did the 99 dance. Just tell them about it. My grandmother and they got home in. I think Jim picked up and started to so we went to and that's one yeah, they had something that's all and everybody across all over the country. My mom still
Mhm.
Part of what I
I'm
heard
s-
from Jim was also that there was job development and finding jobs for different people. And also as they came back from being in the military, that was a huge thing.
Yeah, the network, okay, one network, connected to that network. You know, they had like a social network, they provide, you know, support to everyone and that's it. And that's it, I work this, I work at God Riverside.
Uh-huh.
Yeah, so every day I'm.
Yeah.
I tell folks that,
Up at all. And, important.
no, on that,
Got a Riverside on Columbus.
yeah, project, city.
Folks, I'm sorry, but we're running out of time. We've run out of time, and we need to try to clear this room in the next 5 minutes. Thank you. Thank you, hand for my uncle. Thank you for coming, all of you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
That was great. Thank you so much. That was just great.
Well, you're very welcome. I did not understand. I didn't really know what this was going to be about. I
Well,
really didn't know what, I didn't know I was going to be on stage.
oh, well, you